Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Totality and Infinity. Okay, so we're in section 3, exteriority in the face, and subsection C, the ethical relation and time. And this is going to be the first of 2 videos dealing with this subsection. So we'll deal with the first 3 subsections of the ethical relation and time in this video, and we'll look at the last 2 in the next video. So the first of those 3 for today is pluralism. So the relation with the other is what Levinas calls a radical multiplicity, and he uses that term to distinguish it from a numerical multiplicity. Numerical multiplicity would be a collection of individuals which make up a totality. So they're all individuals, but all subsumed in a greater whole. The radical multiplicity, however, is that multiplicity where the individuals are individual and they maintain that alterity from each other so that they can't be subsumed in this greater whole. So even though they are in relation with each other, they're not subsumed into a totality, into a sameness. Obviously, this is the relation with the other, as I already said. So it's the impossibility then, the radical multiplicity is the impossibility of total reflection. So a totalizing, reflective thought which would bring everything under one umbrella, if you like. He talks about this in terms of comprehension. So comprehension is, if something can be comprehended, it can be brought into it can make sense as a coherent whole, as a totality. That's the opposite of what a radical multiplicity is. It's the impossibility of this total reflection. And this impossibility is maintained not by a negation, but by a surplus. So what does he mean by that? It's the impossibility is sustained not by a negation, because a negation would totalize the 2 parts of the relation. So if one of these multiplicities was negated, was a negation of another, then they both make sense in a greater whole. So it's not maintained in this way. Rather, it's maintained by a surplus, which is the surplus of the epiphany of the other. It's the surplus that the other brings to the relation through their infinite transcendence, through that infinite distance which they maintain from me, through their maintaining that aspect of their radical alterity, absolute alterity. That's what Levinas means by surplus there. So the question he asks then is, what form does this multiplicity take? And the first thing he says about this is that it's neither war nor commerce. This multiplicity can't take the form of either war or commerce. Here's my quote, and then this will explain a little bit more. In war, beings refuse to belong to a totality, refuse community, affirm themselves as transcending the totality, each identifying itself not by its place in the whole, but by itself. So in war, then, you've got these beings, these separated individuals, which deliberately refuse totality. They deny that any kind of attempt to bring them together under a whole, under a single whole. Therefore, for the state of war to come about, to exist, that transcendence, that detachment from that not detachment, but that a relation must be possible, but a relation in which the individuals don't come into a totality. So the idea here is that war presupposes the radical multiplicity that Levinas is talking about. In war, beings they're already separated in this transcendent fashion. They're already the absolute refusal of totality. So war then can't explain this refusal of totality. There's already a radical multiplicity going on whenever there's capacity for war, whenever war arises, whenever that kind of conflict arises here. So multiplicity can't take the form of war because war presupposes this radical multiplicity. And the same with commerce. Commerce already presupposes this notion, because commerce, that mode of interiority, the interiority of possession, labor, economy, all of those things that we talked about earlier, the dwelling, they all they presuppose this relation with the other, which is a radical multiplicity. So neither of those will suffice. But we've got this situation in war. War is possible. This kind of leads us to the next point in the line of questioning. What must the multiplicity be in order for war between separated beings to be possible? If the radical multiplicity leads to war, now we can ask, what kind of situation would allow war to arise, would allow this clash between two individuals which deny totality? What would allow this relation to come about? And Levinas says that it can't be substance. The multiplicities can't be substance, which is causa sui. They can't be self-caused. They can't be completely isolated and in and of themselves, which is obviously a rejection of much of Western metaphysics, particularly Descartes, right, where everything, which divides reality into three substances actually, but for our purposes, the two of those are more relevant: mind and matter, mind and extended substance. So it can't be substance, because such a metaphysical system would mean that each individual is completely self-contained. So there'd be no possibility of war. There'd be no possibility of a clash, because the two things are just completely divorced. There's no sense in which they could come into a relation in the first place, which was obviously the problem that Descartes had, reconciling mind and extended matter, extended substance. So he says they must be then partially independent and partially in relation. We've already come across this notion. We talked about the way that we are both independent and dependent, was the way we phrased it earlier. So we're just kind of circling back to this idea, but perhaps drilling down a little bit deeper, fleshing it out a bit more. So they must be, these individuals in this radical multiplicity must be partially independent and partially in relation. Can we describe this then, Levinas asks, as a finite freedom? Can we say there's a finite, partially free, but kind of restricted? So in being free, they resist the relation, but that freedom is restricted, which means that there's a chance for the relation to come about. And he says, no, this won't work, because a finite freedom is a contradiction in terms. It's an abstract notion that doesn't make any sense. Freedom cannot be limited, he says. That's his claim anyway here. If something is free, it's free totally. It doesn't make sense to say something is free and also restricted in some way. So that leads to the final Levinas' conclusion here, which is that the form of this multiplicity, a multiplicity in which war between separated beings is possible, is temporal. So the beings, the individuals that make up this radical multiplicity are temporal in nature. And by temporal, what we mean is that they have that element of postponement. That element of postponement has come into the individual, has arisen in the individual. That not yet, that sense of not yet. And in particular, Levinas talks about the not yet of death. So this came up earlier when we were talking about commerce and labour and that kind of everyday mode of interiority. We talked about the postponement in relation to death, but just very briefly. But here, Levinas focuses on it a bit more. That postponement is fundamentally and perhaps centrally a postponement of death. Death in the sense that, well, actually I'll read the quote and then that should carry us forward a bit. So essentially what I am is a freedom originally null, offered in death to the other, but in which time arises as a postponement by virtue of which nothing is definitive yet. So a couple of things to break down in that quote. A freedom originally null. So I'm originally a null freedom. What does that mean? That freedom that we thought we were, that we thought we had when we were living in that atheistic, separated sense, that mode of interiority. We thought we were free there, but we discovered that that's actually not freedom, because everything, it was just arbitrary. Everything referred to me. There was no truly external point from which things could gather significance or meaning. So they didn't have any meaning at all. So in that sense, we're a freedom which was originally null, originally a fake, false freedom, if you like, offered in death to the other. So there's that sense of remember we talked about the other being the only way in which murder can take place. That's the only we can only murder an other, because anything else is just a taking possession of. But murder itself, death itself, is only possible in that relation with the other. So we're offered in death to the other, but that possibility of death from this relation, which we're characterizing as war here, is postponed. And it's that delay, that postponement, which is what time is, which is what, I mean, I can say which generates time, but it's not that there is the delay and then that creates something separate, something which we call time. It's that delay is time, that postponement is temporality. So that's how that comes about. Interesting here that I'm a temporal being. That's interesting that kind of everything has come down to temporality again, which is a theme that we see repeatedly, particularly in Heidegger, right? That everything kind of reduces to time. That was the goal anyway, originally, in being in time. And it was the same for Merleau-Ponty. He wanted to reduce everything to that transcendental field, that temporality. And Levinas is doing it here as well. Everything, ultimately, what we are is temporality. We are temporal beings. So it's just interesting to note that despite the differences, there is still this underlying movement. There's still this drive to get us back to time. Time is somehow at the bottom of human existence. Even though, of course, time is grounded in the other for Levinas, which it isn't for anyone else. But still, it's still interesting to note we are fundamentally temporal beings here. And the other thing I wanted to say about this is that this capacity for postponement, this capacity for time to arise, Levinas talks about it as a skill and says that it's only possible in the body. And that's interesting because we've talked about the body before, its importance in this, in allowing and in making possible this independence and dependence, making these two, allowing these two aspects of our being to exist together at the same time. And now we're talking about it in terms of time, postponement, the capacity that we have for postponement. It's a skill only possible in the body, specifically the way that the body allows for the simultaneity of absence and presence. And that's the link to time, presence there. Corporeity is the mode of existence of a being whose presence is postponed at the very moment of his presence. Such a distension in the tension of the instant can only come from an infinite dimension which separates me from the other, both present and still to come, a dimension opened by the face of the other. So this capacity then that the body has of allowing the other to be present to us through the body, but at the same time absent, at the same time separated from us by that infinite distance which we can never overcome. That's what Levinas is talking about, and that's what the body allows. That the body allows this appearance, the manifestation of infinity, and this is so we need the body for that. But what it does is it brings about this merging of presence and absence together, and it's that which allows the distension and the tension of the instant comes about from this infinite dimension which the other opens up before us, but an infinite dimension which is nevertheless present before us. It's nevertheless manifested in some way. And so that capacity that the body gives to the other when they appear to us is what opens up the postponement, is what opens up that delay which allows time. So that's kind of how time comes about there. I think in the last video I mentioned, I wanted to clear this up, so we've got this postponement here arising in the relation with the other, the face-to-face, but we also talked about the postponement arising in commerce, in that everyday mode of existence, in the dwelling, in possession, labor, the way that postponement, we saw a postponement arise there, and I wondered, I wasn't clear whether that postponement was like an inauthentic version or an inauthentic mode of time in comparison to this mode of time which we see revealed in the other, which I thought might be authentic, and I think that distinction might still hold. But the point, I think, is that the time that arises here in relation to the other is it's the original time, if you like. The temporality we see through commerce, through the activities of the separated interior I, the separated I in its interiority, it's grounded in this temporality, which comes about through the relation with the other. Which means there could be an authentic and inauthentic connection, but it's certainly, I think, the time in commerce is grounded in time in the relation with the other. What confused me actually was the way that we've approached this whole story in Levinas. We've started from enjoyment, that mode of living and enjoyment, and then moved to the dwelling and commerce, labor, possession, and now we're finally hitting face to face, the relation with the other. And it's that progression which, I mean, it seems like we're moving kind of up, I guess. We're moving up to the truth. And we are. But what that is, that's not actually how reality is unfolding. That's how our awareness, our understanding is unfolding. So originally we see ourselves as a separated I, living in that mode of enjoyment, and then we see ourselves as in this, through possession, labor, in that mode of commerce, and then we understand that actually we are, everything derives from this mode of, from this authentic relation with the other in the face-to-face. But that's our kind of awareness of the situation. In actual fact, in reality, it's the other way. You start with the relation, the transcendent relation with the other, and that makes everything else possible. But so we've kind of approached it backwards in a sense. But as long as you're clear, everything is grounded in the other, then there shouldn't be too many problems. And the other thing I wanted to mention here is this idea of time as postponement, as delay. It might seem a little bit kind of fuzzy, a little bit, when you try and really think about it. Okay, so you followed through the arguments, all right, it all makes kind of sense. Time is a delay, it is a postponement that arises through this relation with the other, which is a presence and an absence, and brought about by that infinite distance which separates us. It's all good stuff. But then you think, so hold on, how does time come about actually? What is time? And it's then you realize that we haven't actually gotten to an actual, like a metaphysical description of time. And that's because this isn't a metaphysical description of time. None of this is metaphysics. Levinas isn't giving us any solid metaphysics to work with. It's all phenomenology. This is all describing what human existence is like, how human existence can be understood. He's not giving us the metaphysical groundings. I mean, none of this makes sense in terms of metaphysics. You can't talk about the relation with the other because you're already presupposing something to be in relation. You're already presupposing the possibility of relation. You haven't explained anything there. And that's kind of where the metaphysics would come in. You can't talk about delay or postponing because there's so many presuppositions gone into that, metaphysical presuppositions. So you can't talk about that and get kind of, what am I trying to say here? You can't get a metaphysical picture starting with delay or postponement, or even starting with the relation with a transcendent other. These things aren't fundamentally metaphysical. This is all phenomenology. And it's the same problem I had with Merleau-Ponty at the end of Phenomenology of Perception. He tries to make some metaphysical claims about time, particularly subjectivity is consciousness. That's the one I remember. And consciousness is temporality is subjectivity, and subjectivity is temporality. And that is a metaphysical statement, but you can't get there the way that Merleau-Ponty did in Phenomenology of Perception, because it was all phenomenology. You can't get to metaphysics starting with phenomenology. And so that's the kind of the situation we have here, although I don't think Levinas is making any metaphysical claims. He's just describing how temporality arises in terms of phenomenology, in a phenomenological sense. So when all is said and done, you go, yep, good, but what the heck is time? How does time come about? What is it? And those answers aren't here, I think, in Totality and Infinity. And the reason is Levinas is doing phenomenology, not metaphysics. But that's enough rambling about that. So that's the first section, that pluralism, radical multiplicity, and it ends with us. It ends with the understanding, the recognition that for such a radical multiplicity to exist, we must be temporal in nature. And temporality, that postponement, arises from our relation with the other, only made possible by the body. Cool. Second section, history. So the separated will is completely separate in its atheism, its economic mode of existence, but the other comes along and dispossesses it of all of its work. And how does the other do this? They do this in the form of the historian. So here's my quote. History, in which the interiority of each will manifests itself only in plastic form in the muteness of products, is economic history. In history, the will is congealed into a personage interpreted on the basis of his work. So we've already talked about this the way that works don't establish a genuine relation with the author. They just offer us, they signify the author kind of from a third person, from a distance. You no longer have a direct relation. It's this indirect symbol which you can then interpret, which you have to interpret. And that's why works, whether they be works of art or whether they be behaviors or acts, they don't give us this genuine relation. And so in this way, the other dispossesses us of our work by taking those works away from us, by taking them separate from us and interpreting them. And that's what the historian does. The historian is someone who collates actions, behaviors, events, but obviously removed from the people who performed them. He or she takes works of art, stories, novels, whatever, philosophy textbooks, but by definition, well, not by definition, kind of by definition as history, the authors aren't there, directly there to back them up, to back up what they said, to allow for this more genuine face-to-face relation to take place. So what we get is this third person separated interpretation of the work. And in this way, we are separated from our acts. We're dispossessed of them. So this is quite a Sartrean way of thinking about it. This is something that Sartre talks about a lot, obviously. And it's not the direct. So even though we're talking about a relation with the other here, the other in the form of the historian, it's not that the historian is not the face-to-face relation, because by definition, the other is, or the author is absent from their work. Levinas calls this fate, which is the definition he gives. It's the accounts of the survivors who interpret, that is, utilize the works of the dead. Really Sartrean idea here. We're kind of abandoned to, our being is abandoned to, left to in the hands of other people. Once I'm gone and I can no longer back up my ideas, my thoughts, my actions, then I'm at the mercy of other people. I'm at the mercy of others. They can reinterpret them. They can interpret them however they like, however they see fit. And so that's the point that Levinas is making there. But he goes a little bit further to say, how is this possible? How can the happy will, that will in that economic mode of existence, how can it have its happiness stripped from it like this? How is it possible for a complete interiority, living in that mode of enjoyment, completely happy in and of itself? How is it possible for that to be stripped from it? How is it possible for them to be dispossessed of their works, and then and that happiness lost? And the answer is something that we saw just before as well. We've talked about it before, the body. So the body again here comes up, and it's because the body is that connection of absence and presence, infinite and finite, mind and matter. It's those two dualities merged together. Again, in a way that Levinas doesn't explain metaphysically, but that doesn't detract from the truth of it, which we can ascertain and describe phenomenologically. So the happy will can have its happiness stripped from it like this because it is a body. Specifically because it is both a biological thing and a subjective point of view simultaneously. It's not that we are things sometimes and we switch to being it's not that we're physical things and we switch to being non-physical consciousnesses or subjectivities, and then we go back and forth. The body is both of these things together. And this is, if you've read Sartre, this is exactly, Sartre talks about this in a lot of detail. And it's the same thing here, where both of these things, the body is both physical and this other subjectivity, a point of view, is what Levinas calls it, which is quite a good way of thinking of it. A point of view simultaneously. So the happy will postponing its inevitable death, that's the point of view of the body. That's the point of view aspect of the body, if you like, where we're not just a thing, but we are and it's not even, we can't even think of it as the body as the medium through which we interact in the world and live out these enjoyable, happy existences in that through labor and possession and the dwelling and all that stuff. It's because that again presupposes this notion that what we really are is a mind separate from the body. The body is that mode of engagement. There isn't something separate going on here. There isn't a separate, detached mind acting through the body. The body is this point of view. It's this happy will postponing its inevitable death. But that happy will postponing its inevitable death, that subjectivity, that point of view dimension of the body, is vulnerable because it's also a thing, a physical object at the same time. It's both at the same time. And that's kind of the phenomenological insight. Again, there's no metaphysics to back that up. We don't have a metaphysical description here, but that's fine. I mean, Levinas isn't doing metaphysics as far as I'm concerned. But that's what the body is. That's how both take place. Levinas calls this, with quite a nice expression, the mortality of the will. So the will is like that point of view aspect of the body, and the mortality aspect is the fact that we're a physical body, a physical thing, which is therefore vulnerable. It's therefore susceptible to death. So that's a nice expression, the mortality of the will. And also he calls it the duality of betrayal and fidelity. And the way that I understand this is betrayal, because we are exposed to the other through our works. Our works are exposed to the other. We are exposed to being dispossessed of our works and having our being and our lives interpreted or misinterpreted by the other. So there's an element of betrayal there, but also fidelity. And the fidelity is the way in which we're able to preserve our economic interiority. We're able to preserve ourselves in that kind of everyday mode of existence where we are happy. We're a happy will. We're living in that mode of enjoyment. So that's cool. The body as the mortality of the will, a duality of betrayal and fidelity, and just another way another aspect, I guess, of our relation with the other, and specifically the way that the other can dispossess us of our works and interpret them in any way they like. Finally, the last section today, death. So typically we think of death either as a passage to nothingness or a passage to another existence. That is to say, as either as being or nothingness, which is not a reference to Sartre, if you can believe that. But that's how we usually think of death, right? Either as kind of absolute nothingness or as an afterlife of some sort. Levinas rejects this, though, and again, we're talking about death as from a phenomenological standpoint, from the point of view of how it concerns us as existing human beings. And so how does it concern us? What relation do we have with death, with our deaths? And he says that death it appears menacing, but it appears menacing because it is imminent, it's an irreducible oncoming movement, and it's unforeseeable. The imminence of the menace does not come from a precise point of the future. The unforeseeable character of the ultimate instant is not due to an empirical ignorance, to the limited horizon of our understanding, which a greater understanding would have been able to overcome. The unforeseeable character of death is due to the fact that it does not lie within any horizon. It is not open to grasp. So death is menacing because it's imminent and unforeseeable, but it doesn't lie within any horizon of our lives. That's the reason it's menacing. That's the reason this imminence and unforeseeability makes it menacing, because it's fundamentally outside of our capacity to grasp. It's by what it is, what death is. It's beyond our capacity to understand. It's beyond our capacity to grasp. It doesn't lie within any horizon in which we can imagine, in which we can comprehend our existence. And this is so Heideggerian. It's if you read Being and Time, this is, I mean, this could just have been plucked straight out of there. So that's fine. And he even says, he even has the uses the expression, the impossibility of every possibility, which is, he doesn't quote Heidegger, but almost those verbatim. That's from Being and Time. And Sartre says something very similar. Death is completely outside of our lives. It's therefore ungraspable. It's a fundamental unknowability. So death approaches then in this way, from this point beyond which we can get a hold of it, which is to say that it approaches from a transcendence. It approaches from a transcendent point, not just a point far away. Death doesn't come to us from a precise point in the future. It's not something we can tangibly kind of comprehend as a part of our lives. It's outside of our very lives, of our very existences. So it approaches from a transcendent point, which means that, and this is the important idea here, death appears as if it is one of the modalities of my relation with the other. So death appears as if it is another aspect of our relation with the other. And this is an idea in Sartre as well, but Levinas, because Levinas has a different conception of the other, it comes with kind of a different valence, I guess I could say. So it approaches in this way because that's the relation with the other is a relation with a transcendence. Right? It's a relation with something completely separate, completely detached from me, an ultimate alterity, an absolute alterity. Death is the same thing, we've discovered. Death, my relation with death is of the exact same nature. It's a relation with something completely outside of my life, completely outside of my existence, beyond my being. So I've got two quotes which I want to give you, and then we'll discuss them. The other, inseparable from the very event of transcendence, is situated in the region from which death, possibly murder, comes. Thus, the fear for my being, which is my relation with death, is not the fear of nothingness, but the fear of violence. And thus it extends into fear of the other, of the absolutely unforeseeable. So what I originally thought here was that Levinas is trying to connect death to the other. So everything comes from the other, right? The other grounds everything. And I thought Levinas was trying to connect death in the same way. But I don't think that's what's actually going on here. He's not trying to ground death in the other, but he's trying to point out that our relation to death is the same as the relation to the other. And inasmuch then as we have a transcendent relation with the other, we also have a transcendent relation with death, and the connection between those two is the capacity for my death to come about through violence, through war, through murder. That's the word Levinas uses here, right? We can only be murdered by the other. That's the only sense in which murder is possible. And so that's kind of the connection here. We see death in that it seems as if it comes from, or in that it does come from the same place as the other, from a transcendent point outside of my existence. We see it as coming to us through violence, because that's what It's the only way we can make sense of it, coming as it does from this transcendent point, the same place that the other comes towards us. So that's an interesting idea, and that kind of takes us into different territory from Sartre a little bit, because for Sartre, since death is outside of all horizons of our existence, for Sartre, it's not part of our being as being for itself. It's part of our being as being for others. So Sartre sees death as something which comes to us from the other, not from part of our own being. And Levinas sees it the same way, but the difference is in the way that the different takes these two philosophers have on the other. But it's interesting to see how all of these kind of connect up: Heidegger, Sartre, and Levinas here. So the relation to death is the same. It extends, I guess, into our relation to the other. And the final point here is that since death is imminent, well, this is not the final point actually, but since death is imminent, since death is, we see death, we understand, we apprehend death to the extent that we do as something imminent, its menace is derived from its imminence, then it's already a postponement. So if death can be imminent, then it's already postponed. And this is just another instance, or it's something we've already talked about, the not yet of death. And we saw how that comes about through the body, through our relation to the other. So it just all of the threads kind of connect up here. Since death is imminent, it's already a postponement, it's already temporal, and it already comes about through our encounter with transcendence, with the transcendent other. And this is the final point: death cannot drain all meaning from my life. And according to Levinas, and that's because I'm not simply a being enclosed in interiority, I am a being for the other. So the other remains yet in relation with me and permits me to will, but with a will that is not egoist, a will that flows into the essence of desire, whose center of gravitation does not coincide with the eye of need, the desire that is for the other. Remember, we talked about this desire at the beginning of the book. We gave it a capital D at that time. Levinas called it the metaphysical desire, which is that desire for transcendence, for the transcendent other. And he distinguishes it from need, which is related to the I in interiority, the I in that mode of economic existence. So this is, we kind of move beyond that when we encounter the other, when we encounter that face to face. We still have a will, but it's not a will centered on me anymore. It's not a will centered on the I. It's not a will centered on a separated atheistic existence. Now it's separated on. Now it's directed towards this transcendent point, and because of that, death then doesn't drain meaning from my life, because there's this transcendent point beyond my life, beyond my existence, which kind of safeguards or guarantees meaning, even when the I, which I am, the I in interiority, comes to an end in death, when it dies. So this is very non-Heideggerian and non-Sartrean. The idea that meaning can be salvaged, meaning in our lives can be salvaged through the other. I like it, and I kind of don't like it as well. I like it because, again, Levinas is really giving a lot of bringing other people into what it is to be a human being. He's incorporating them in a positive way in our human existences. But we must also remember, keep in mind, that the other is actually God in Levinas. So he doesn't stress that. He doesn't emphasize that at all. We talked about it once, way back at the beginning of the book, where he said the other is kind of a passage to God. And it's not like other people, but that's something which has really been downplayed, I think, in Totality and Infinity. It's possible that I've just ignored it or missed it, but I don't think so. I think he really hasn't mentioned it, actually, since that first time we talked about it way back at the beginning. And that's kind of where, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to say Levinas is trying to deceive us or lure us into Judaism, but just remember that's what it is for Levinas. So whereas I've been really kind of getting behind this idea of the other, in the way that Levinas makes the other central to our lives, I'm thinking about it from a very secular standpoint, where the other is actually other people. And I think there is a lot of value in that. And Levinas has been talking about it like that as well. I think that's a fair comment. But the other for Levinas is ultimately God. So that there's kind of a little bit of a bait and switch maybe going on here. We've set up the other as other people, but kind of secretly, it's actually God that we're talking about here. So just keep that in mind anyway. You might like that. Maybe that's what gives Levinas value for you. But yeah, just that's where we are. Let's have a look at a summary. So first we looked at pluralism, the first topic. We talked about the way that we are a radical multiplicity. That's what it is to exist. Human existence is an existence as a radical multiplicity, not a numerical multiplicity. And ultimately it is realized as temporality. So everything we ultimately have to understand ourselves as temporal beings. Importantly here, the fact that we can be temporality requires the body in particular of the other, to be present as absence. The way that the other through their body is present, but at the same time as a transcendental absolute alterity, they are also absent at the same time. That is what the body is. Then we talked about history and the way that the other determines my meaning as the historian, the way that they dispossess me of my works. So our works always, they don't allow for a genuine connection with the author. They always give us a third person kind of shell, which we interpret, dispossessing the author of their work. And this also requires the body. This time we're talking about the body of the author, the duality that they have as a thing and at the same time as a point of view. It's this which allows the content will, the content separated I of interiority, to have that happiness stripped from them, to have their meaning taken away from them by the transcendent other. And finally, we looked at death. And the idea here is that our relation to death is the same as our relation to the other. It's unforeseeable, it's transcendent, it comes to us from this point outside of any horizon which makes sense within our own lives. However, meaning can be salvaged through that relation to the other, because my relation to that transcendent other is, although I'm still a will, I'm still a willing being, my will is now directed to this transcendent point beyond my life, which gives my life meaning, meaning that death ultimately is not seen as something absurd. It's not seen as something which strips meaning from my life, because I'm more than just the I of interiority. I'm an I before, I'm an I for the other. And that is where I'm going to call it here. I don't think I have anything extra to say there. Let's wrap it up there. The next video will finish up this subsection, the ethical relation in time, and then we're almost there. We're almost finished. There's only a little bit left after that. So thanks for sticking with me through this video, and I'll see you in the next one.